Alright folks, this is going to be a fairly short video about the story that is in Growing Up in the South. It is the William Faulkner story that I've assigned this particular week, and this video is intended to help you if you are completely and utterly confused by this story. This is a story that when I've taught this class in the past and I've assigned it as a part of the reading in the classroom, we have managed as a class to sit down and work our way through it. Since we're online, we don't have that luxury, so follow along. I'm not going to recount the major points because that would just totally defeat the purpose. I think that most of you wouldn't read it if I sat here and recounted all of the entire plot. So what I'm going to do instead is point you to some of the important aspects of the entire story so that way you have a better sense of how it operates. Now, let me say first that William Faulkner is a very difficult writer. His sentence structure is very complicated. His sentences have been described by students before as they wind back around on themselves. They seem to twist and turn and not know where they're going. This is all intentional. He is a modernist writer, and he tries to write from the perspective of stream of consciousness. This story is not exactly stream of consciousness, but it does reflect the turmoil inside the main character's mind. So if you have noticed that the sentences seem to just pound on and on and on very quickly, this oftentimes is because it is reflecting the main character's, again, turmoil inside of himself as he tries to grapple with the situation that's been thrust upon him. I want to start by going to page 389. Page 389. On 389 we find who lives by the sword dies by the sword. This is the sort of creed of the Old South in the story. The Old South is represented by the main character's father. The father has lived by the sword and died by the sword for a great period of time, up and through the Civil War, for example. So this is an important line, and it's an important aspect of the story because it's what the main character struggles with as he, again, goes to face off with the circumstances themselves. So this is, as you are thinking about the story and trying to understand what the story is attempting to accomplish, that is an essential line to that particular understanding. Another one is if you go over to page 396, this is an important one, and it follows up with the lives by the sword, dies by the sword thing. So here we have Sutpen and Sartoris are having a confrontation, and it's being recounted here for you, the reader. So Sutpen is on his land, and Sartoris, listed here as father, goes out and says, "Are you with us or against us?" And Sutpen said, "I'm for my land, and if every man of you would rehabilitate his own land, the country will take care of itself." And Sartoris, father, challenged him to bring the lamp out and set it on a stump where they could both see to shoot, and Sutpen would not. Nobody could have more of a dream than that. Yes, but his dream is just Sutpen. John, Sartoris, is not. This is Sartoris' elder. He is thinking of this whole country which he is trying to raise by its bootstraps. In other words, Sartoris is a dreamer. He is this elder statesman who is trying to put the South back together after the events of the Civil War. And in some senses, that is in the background of the entire story. I mean, it's what carries it, because it is Sartoris' dream that the entire country can be put back together. And he's not looking after just his own farm, he's looking after everyone. If you finish looking at the passage here in 396, you'll see that this is exactly what is taking place in that particular section. I do want to point out before I go much further here, if you were to think about, by the way, whether or not Drusilla is a cross-dresser and has ever cross-dressed, and if you were trying to figure that part out as you were reading, I know some students get confused. She is indeed a cross-dresser. She cross-dressed as a man in order to participate in the Civil War. She's not the only one, by the way, and we'll discuss that as we move forward throughout the entire semester. Alright, so let's skip forward to pages 402 and 403. Because this is another important aspect. Yes, Drusilla is Bayard, the main character's stepmother, and Drusilla does kiss Bayard at one point. She sort of throws herself at him, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But After she does that, after Bayard feels guilty for it, and he goes and confronts his father and says, I've kissed your wife, and after his father essentially says, yeah, okay, big deal, because he says, huh? Sit down, right? I sat down, I looked at him, watched him fill both glasses, and this was in some senses worse than if his father had even gotten upset about it. But on the next page, this is where it's important, because Sartoris basically tells him, now the land and time too are changing. What will follow will be a matter of consolidation, of pettifogging, and doubtless chicanery, in which I would be a babe in arms, but in which you, trained in the law, Bayard, can hold your own, our own. In other words, Sartoris is passing off the torch of responsibility and statesmanship to his son at this particular point. This is an important aspect of this story because, again, this is floating around in the background. And in just a second, I'm going to give you a sort of key that helps you to understand the entire story. But he is passing the torch here to his son, Bayard. And Bayard, never really feels like he can live up to it. And again, we'll address that in just a second. All right, a couple of more things. I want you to at least know that if we look at page 408 briefly, Drusilla gets very upset. She's already handed the guns over to him on 407 and take them, I have kept them for you, I give them to you. Oh, you will thank me, you will remember me, who put into your hands what they say is an attribute only of God's, meaning death. She is talking about death. She is giving him into his hands death. And then on 408, though, she touches him, and suddenly there's some kind of communication. She manages to figure out exactly what's going to happen, what Bayard has in his mind, even if Bayard himself doesn't quite have it as a plan yet. So when she touches him, she becomes very, very upset because she realizes that he is not going to go and kill Redmond. And that's a big deal to her because she is a woman and she would have already revenged her husband if it hadn't been for the fact that she's a woman and they wouldn't give her guns. So she admires Bayard for being able to go out and being able to shoot Redmond with guns, but she's very upset that she can't. And when she realizes that he, a man, won't do something that she, a woman, would do, if not for her gender, she becomes violently upset and can't stop laughing. This also continues, by the way, if we scoot forward to 414 and 415, this is where his friend George Wyatt also receives the exact same message. And in this particular case, he is very upset. He even says in 415, is your name Sartoris? By God, if you don't kill him, I'm going to. Again, this is a tradition that this group of people, this generation, has continued up and through the Civil War into the present day. But again, if you think back to the torch being passed by Sartoris to his son, he's basically saying, living by the sword, dying by the sword is not an option any longer. Now it is about law. Now it is about law and order, and you, Bayard, have to continue picking up where I have to leave off by thinking about, again, living by the sword and dying by the sword. All right, and then this brings us to the conclusion. The conclusion of the story, again, I'm not going to say what it is. I assume that you've read it. Bayard basically faces off and establishes his own identity as concerns the situation. Now, here's the key I was talking about just a minute ago. And I'll try to say this slowly so that you can perhaps write it down and at least look at the pages. I'm not going to read off each passage on each page, but pages 392, 393, 394, 404 to 405, 407, 408, 412, and 421. And if you need to, you can rewind and watch that as many times as you need to write it down. Those are important moments in the story in which Verbena is mentioned. Now, Verbena is a representation of tradition in the entire story. So it's a stand-in, it's a metaphor for tradition. If you notice in the early passages that I just gave you a second ago, Drusilla says that if she loved the smell of verbena because it's the only thing she could smell above horses and courage, meaning it's tradition guiding these people into this task, into the Civil War, where they have gotten into fights with other people on the battlefield. So Verbena is driving the entire Civil War. The tradition of slavery, the tradition of the economic conflict between the North and the South is driving men to the battlefield. This makes Drusilla, in some senses, the priestess, and it's even mentioned in the story, the priestess of tradition. She keeps attempting to indoctrinate Bayard into this older tradition. She keeps putting pieces of tradition, Verbena, onto his clothes. She'll put it in the lapel of his jacket. She'll give it to him. He says that he can smell it. And she, again, becomes violently upset when she realizes that he's not going to buy into this tradition. So this is the older tradition. Live by the sword, die by the sword. At the end of the story, however, when Bayard has faced off, when he has made his own decision and created his own tradition, because that is the outcome of the story, he refuses to participate in the prior tradition and creates his own entirely. When Bayard has created his own tradition and he goes back to his room, if you look on the very last page of the story, page 421, he thinks it is the verbena in his jacket he's smelling, right? The one on his lapel. But instead he finds the single sprig of it. Without looking, she would pinch off a half dozen of them, and they would be all of a size, almost all of a shape, as if a machine had stamped them out. In other words, again, she's a priestess. She's creating people who are of that certain tradition. But this it here is important because it doesn't even have a name. The verbena, the flower itself, this tradition, this metaphor of tradition, is so new that it can't even be named. It's just an it. It's a they. It's a them past that point. Verbena is mentioned slightly above that, but this is the old verbena that she's already given to him that's in his jacket. This new verbena that's on his pillow is only an it at this particular point. So if you think of the story in those terms, if you think of it as being about tradition, if you think of it as the conflict between old tradition and new tradition, then essentially Faulkner has created a sort of dialogue surrounding the Civil War in which he gets to record his version of what he thinks happened and put it down for people generations later like ourselves to be able to read it and to interpret it in those particular ways. This is important as we move forward into studying writers because writers have that power. Percy Shelley called writers, or technically poets is what he said in his quote, but he means all writers, the unacknowledged legislators of the world, meaning that these are individuals who, through their art, through crafting a story, they get to say something about the world that generations later no average person gets to say. So basically, if you are a police officer, say 200 years ago, and you never wrote a single word in your life, the only thing you've left behind, really, for posterity is your name and perhaps some records associated with you. But Shakespeare, who lived 400 years ago, wrote plays, and we still remember him and think about him and talk with his work, I should say, even until the present day. The same thing goes with Faulkner. Faulkner has created a work about the South that is his view of the South, and now we get to engage with this work and this book and say to ourselves, is this what the South was like? Is this not what the South was like? And that's an important question concerning writers in general. Why do writers get to create the world? Why are they so important? And the fact is they are important, and the work that they do is very important. And that's why I like to start the semester with that story out of this book, because it does talk about tradition. It follows with some of the themes that we've addressed so far in the entire course. It rewards the thoughts that we've already had to this point, and it's a nice segue into writing, and then beyond this particular point, into talking about things like gender. Gender is going to be a difficult, unusual conversation if you've never had a course on gender before, but this is, again, a nice segue. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here because it's been almost 15 minutes. I will end by saying, small clue for those of you who actually watch this all the way through, I like to reward you, that the name of Sertorius's horse is Jupiter. That's important, and that's sort of a freebie if you've watched this entire video to this point. You're welcome. I will see you guys next week. Also watch the couple of slides that I have.